Hi, Trevor here. Today I'm going to go over how to create a remote desktop server in Hyper-V that users will connect to using a VPN so that they can remotely access their files on a corporate network. So I have here a server 2019 Hyper-V host. So we go new virtual machine. I'm going to call this RDS V8. I have my default storage as D Hyper-V configs. I'm going to select generation 2. I'm going to assign 8 gigs of memory to start. I'm going to use dynamic memory. Now, if you want better performance, you are not going to want to use dynamic memory, and you're going to want to set your startup memory to be the amount of memory you want the system to have. Configure networking. For the purposes of this demonstration, I am using my lab connection, and I'm going to use the default 127 gigabyte disk, and it's a VHDX file located in D Hyper-V virtual hard disks. Installation options. I'm going to select my Windows Server 2019 ISO. Hit finish. Now, before I go through and turn this on to start the installation, I want to go to the settings and make a few changes. So for dynamic memory, I want to set the minimum amount to be my same as my startup RAM, and the maximum RAM, I'm going to set it for 26 gigs of memory, 20% memory buffer, and I'm going to give it a higher memory weight to improve performance. I'm going to select 4 virtual processors, and I am going to enable guest services here, and back under processors. If I ever want to migrate this to a different type system, I'll want to check the processor compatibility. Now, if you're not planning on doing that, or if you're going to want to get the most performance, you should have that unchecked. Then I'm going to apply, hit OK, and then we're going to start up. And we'll go through the Windows install. So I'm just going to go with the defaults, but you can go ahead and change these to be whichever you'd like. For the purposes of this demonstration, it doesn't matter. Of course, depending on how your system is set up, will determine the performance of the virtual machine. So if you have a product key, now would be a good time to put it in. I am going to select I don't have a product key, and I'm going to also select Server 2019 Standard Desktop Experience. Accept the terms of the license. Custom install. Select the disk. And we'll come back once Windows is all installed. Alright, so the system's done its first round of installs, and it will reboot now. So I'm going to double check something. Yeah, in the network adapter, I have to add a VLAN tag of 18 That's just because for the purposes of this demonstration, we're doing it on VLAN tag 18 for my lab network. So for setting up this remote desktop server, we're going to start by setting up the server without a domain controller and without a domain. It will work, it won't work great, and your remote apps won't really work. If you want to get the full functionality of it, it does need to be connected to a domain. And also for user management and that kind of thing, it makes it a million times easier. It also makes it easier for setting up remote apps and all that other really great stuff that you're going to want to give your users. So I had originally set up a remote desktop server because I could see that things were going to be getting shut down. And I had actually set it up in about 6 hours with all the apps that I needed to install on it and configure it. So for the purposes of this demo, the password is capital P, password 123. Okay. We're going to log in. All right, so here's our remote desktop server. So right now, I don't have a direct connection to the internet for this system. I am using my lab VLAN, which is an isolated VLAN. The network we're connecting to already has a domain controller set up on it so that we can connect it to the domain after we get the regular remote desktop services set up and installed. Okay, so to install the remote desktop services, I want to go to Add Roles and Features. I'm going to select Role-Based Feature Installation. This is so we can have a remote desktop server without having a domain authenticated user. I want remote desktop services. I will probably want remote access at some point. And everything else there looks fine. I want .NET Framework 3.5 for possibly some additional software. We'll also take the PathIO, network load balancing, the RAS connection manager, RPC over HTTP proxy, simple TCP IP services, Windows internal database. I'm not going to take that differential compression, but if we were doing a lot of file transfers, we may want to take that as well. Yeah, that's all we're going to take for now. So we want the remote desktop connection broker, gateway, licensing, session, and web. Direct access and VPN, routing and web application proxy. We have the web services. Yeah, we're going to leave all this as default. We need to specify alternative path source. In this case, our alternative source is D sources SXS, and we'll just copy that path and paste it in the path field in the wizard. All right, now that we've put our path in and we've started to install, this is a multi reboot step process. So once we get the install going, there will be I think 3 reboots by the time all is said and done. All right, now let's just reboot the system to get the installation going again. After we demonstrate that we are able to log in with local users to the remote desktop session server, we'll connect it to a domain controller, and then we'll be able to finalize setting up the remote desktop services and set up some remote apps, and you'll be able to see how much more you get with the Active Directory controller with a remote desktop session server. All right, after that first setup, let's see where we are with our remote desktop server, with what services we need to finish installing, if any. We'll go ahead and do that, and then we will proceed with connecting it to the domain controller and setting up the remote desktop session server with the ability to add remote apps. We'll be able to tell what's been added through the Server Manager dashboard once it finishes loading. So it's taken an awfully long time to load, so we'll just go back to the Manage, Add Roles and Features, and double check and make sure that all the roles and features that we wanted to add were added. If not, we will add them again. So I'm just going to go through the add roles and features, make sure we have our remote desktop services roles did not install. So let's get that fixed. We want gateway licensing. I want the session host and the web. Okay, and our path, it's kept it from last time. But we did get our file services installed. So we'll just wait for this to install and we'll have another look. Okay, so the system's decided to reboot. You can see it's working on updates. And now it's restarting. So as I was saying before, I had got this server set up to allow staff to work remotely if we had to shut down our office because of COVID-19, which did end up being the case. It took me about 4 to 6 hours to set up. That was installing Office and some third-party vendor software that isn't typical type software to use. I came up with a whole documentation for getting people to install a VPN client and then connecting to the server with their remote desktop session client that they have installed in Windows, or they go get it from the Apple Store on a Macintosh computer. Now, I suppose it would have been possible to set up something like the web version of VNC and have every user connect to their own workstation, but the logistics of that and trying to support that would be a nightmare. Having everything in one place where an admin can log in, do a remote shadow session on the remote desktop server, or using TeamViewer or MSRP 360 to remotely look at their remote desktop client or their computer at home, makes it far more simpler and easier to support. Alright, so reboot and configuration is finished. Let's see how we did. Our password 123. We'll see what the server manager says. So we still have features to install. Looks like remote desktop licensing is set up. There's our remote desktop. So we have our direct access VPN and web application proxy to set up. That's our licensing. So that's a remote desktop server. So what I'm doing here is I'm just checking to make sure that I'm getting a proper IP address on my VLAN network to make sure that I'm able to communicate with a client server, a remote desktop client. Alright, so now I'm going to just connect to my other server to check the remote desktop client. Make sure I can get to the RD gateway on the lab network. I'll just put the IP address in. And we have IIS. And I think I need to put in, is it WebRD? No, it's RD Web. Yeah, it's not WebRD. It's RD Web. And all right, we don't have our SSL certificate set up, but we're there. We've got a privacy error and we have our RD gateway. Okay, now I'm going to sign in as a localhost administrator because that's the account I have. I'll put in our password 123, and we don't have any published apps or anything, but we're able to log in, which is good. So our remote desktop server is definitely working. We need to hook it into a domain to get the full functionality. But here, we can do a test. Localhost administrator, password 123. There we are. So you can see our remote desktop service is apparently working. Everything looks good. And so far we're only about 30 minutes in. Alright, so the next step for this here is to hook the machine up to the domain and finish configuring the remote desktop session services and getting RD gateway set up and remote app. Okay, let's get this machine hooked up to domain. Let's go to this PC, properties, and advanced system settings. Description, RDS, V8. In case you're wondering why I'm calling it RDS V8, this is the 8th version of this setup. Something interesting is when I was working on this on my other lab machine, this one here, when I set up the remote desktop server, the remote desktop services says it was installed, but that it wasn't showing up in the server manager, which makes it kind of difficult to manage without it being in the server manager. We'll just wait for this to finish booting up. Apparently I need to fix my time too. Okay, so we'll just let this sort itself out. We'll come back when it's finished sorting itself out. Okay, so we're just getting to desktop. It's been about 3 minutes for our first login. It's slow, but it's not horrible. And like I said, depending on what you're running for the virtual machine, and how much resources you allocate to it, will give you a performance difference. So we're actually running about 17%. We got 4 virtual processors and a bunch of RAM. All right. So now to finish up with having it connected to the domain, we go to Roles and Features. And we want it is a server role. Why isn't there we are. Roles and Features. We want Remote Desktop Services installation. And I just want a quick start deployment. We have most of everything installed, and we're not doing multiple servers. This will let us do remote app and remote desktop services on a single server, which is what we're doing. And it's going to be session-based desktop deployment. There's our server. Server will be restarted. That's fine. Deploy. This part won't take very long. All right, and you can see here we have a URL for a remote app. All right, so I'm just going to switch back to my remote desktop client. We're going to try log in on the domain. So I'll put in my username and password. Now because, and there we go. We can see the remote apps. They're all published. We got calculator. We're getting certificate errors because I have no authentication set up to pass everything through. But we'll get that. I'll get that fixed at some point. What I really care about is just the remote desktop session server. Oh, bad password. Let's fix that. There we go. It's connected. Now, because this is a first login, it has some things it needs to set up. So, but after the first login, it should be fairly quick, even on this old quad-core server of mine. It's taking a little longer. We just need to be patient. There we go. We have a calculator that's running like an app off that server though. So now we're going to just test doing a remote desktop connection test. A regular remote desktop connection. There we go. Put in our domain credentials, the one we just used. And we can see that was nice and fast. We got the desktop up real quick. And we're off to the races. So the way that I had planned to set this up, user connects with OpenVPN, and then they get their RD client file, they double click it, and they're into the system. I hope you found this tutorial useful.